Thanks, folks, and I really appreciate Adriana and the whole team there at Warsaw University of Warsaw, for inviting me here. Per my abstract, which has the original intent of this kind of has changed, and as you can see, we have a lot of topics to cover. What I've been working on this for about a year on what I call destructive institutions. It didn't start that way. It started in a couple different directions, but basically, quite frankly, just looking at the world and looking at the way things were going, especially in America. I was trying to basically deep dive. I'm a systems engineer, analyst, worked in information technologies and communication technologies for about 40 years. And decided to turn my efforts into institutional analysis using system-based approaches. And so basically, I developed this framework and then look at these seven applications here. And the original 4 applications you can see on the top there: slavery, climate change, mass shootings in America, and opioid crisis. And then the other, I had a little extra time in March, and I did the other 3 as well, added them on. Just want to make note that all the work here is under Creative Commons copyright license 4.0 by, and so it makes it easy for other researchers who would like to do some follow-on work with this or take it in any direction you might want to go. There are several papers that are up on the Internet Archive, archive.org. If you search my name, you can find that the body of work there, and we're going to cover that in a second. Okay, hang on. Let's try it. I'm gonna have to use my mouse. There we go. Okay, so just as foundation to this, and what you'll see in the preface of all the working papers is the declaration, two clauses from the Declaration of Independence, or you might call the American Manifesto. Basically, what I'm leveraging is leveraging the concept of unalienable rights in the first clause there, and that's what governments are instituted for, is to secure those rights. And basically, as you might figure out, destructive institutions are not securing those rights, either for profit or in governmental sense. And then the second clause there, I like to leverage as well, is that change is difficult, and even if people are suffering, they're willing to kind of live with that rather than go through changes, unless you're forced through a pandemic, as we see right now, which might cause some. That's for another panel at this point, but I'll get into some of that as well. Presentation outline. I'll talk about the framework up front, and then I'll get into some new definitions that I have here, and then get into the application description and talk about the elimination. How might you eliminate some of these destructive institutions? So I'm not deep diving into any particular topic of climate crisis, et cetera. It's more of looking across them all and looking at the commonality of them. So if you take a look at the purpose of the body of work, it's one is systems based. It is trying to look at the commonality of destructive institutions, whether governmental or non-governmental. That would be for profit or for political power that you might see in totalitarian states as an extreme. And then by having that commonality, you can look at systematic root causes as well, because that's common as well here. So any of the discussion that I'm looking at here in terms of elimination of these destructive institutions, I'm looking at the common causes. I'm not going specifically into any one of these destructive institutions and saying specifically, here's what to do, here's what to do, here's what to do. I'm looking at them across the board. And the first paper had the framework, and then 4 applications, as I mentioned, and you can see them there. And then the next 3 applications were in separate papers. And again, all posted up. If you go in the back of this presentation, there's a link directly to the Internet Archive for those papers. Continue on with the purpose here of the body of work. The common framework approach and applications being separate and distinct, connected through a contract. This concept is basically analogous to cloud computing. That's what you see in cloud computing. So you have a cloud, and then you have an application interface coming off of it, And then if you meet that interface, you pull in all the resources of the cloud. Same thing here. Except the difference is this is not top-down design. This is more of a bottom-up, spontaneous order that you'll be seeing. It's just, these destructive institutions, as you'll see, the commonality is based on the fact that humans kind of work in certain ways, and you can see certain affinities in functions and the way they come together. And so, keep that in mind that this does have that framework contract to different application approach. Now the contract varies. The contract structure is the same. Clauses are the same. The difference goes in how they manifest themselves. Mass shootings manifest differently from climate crisis. Okay, so the paper outline is here for the framework. I'm just kind of showing this as kind of generally what the content is. I just want to focus almost in the top right corner there, the independence of destructive institutions from political and economic philosophies and systems. So, at the extreme case, you have, totalitarian communism, totalitarian fascism, and they all fit under this umbrella as well. And then, obviously, on the economic side, you can easily have socialist systems that are destructive, and you can have capitalist systems destructive. Difference is, I think, capitalism kind of lends itself, especially with the neoliberalism that we've seen here in the last couple of decades. With the push for low regulation, it makes it easier for these to exist. Because low regulation is a way of getting to almost like a designed-in failure, right? You're designing these failures in to the system. The other thing I did here was, again, this is qualitative work, and it's really more theoretical side. So I didn't go out and gather specific data on this and do a quantitative analysis. So I created in a separate paper, supplement number 1, which is uploaded as well. I created a cross-check for conspiratorial influences, and so there's 15 characteristics that are cross-checked against, like beliefs, unprovable, etc., and took a look at that, and then went one by one and saying, well, where does this work fit against that? And basically, in every one of these cases, you can see that the work is, I think, pretty solid. But I'll leave that for your judgment as well. And the connectivity of the functions is not mystical. It's not some big leap, like leaping from 5G wireless to COVID, right? Not some kind of leap like that, or JFK or something else, or UFOs. It's observable. You can look at this. You can measure it. Some of the aspects. I did not go out and do measurements, but I'd like to see if somebody wants to do some follow-up research on this. I think it'd be great. So here's some linkages to some key social sciences concepts. And again, just, when I started this off as a systems engineer. I didn't go into the social sciences piece of this. And so I looked at the social sciences kind of after I was moving along in it, and then started looking at some of the relationships. And so, this is kind of like the greatest hits of dysfunctional, societies here. And these all have a relationship to this framework and to the way destructive institutions function. So this is just to put context on destructive institutions, where they fit in kind of a span of institutions. At the very bottom here, you have risk managed institutions like automobiles, trains, blah, blah, blah. And it's mostly reasonably regulated, right? So, you're not trying to deliberately go out there and cause, or cause death for money, right? You're not doing that. Now, as you start moving up, you start getting to harmful institutions, tobacco, alcohol, unhealthy foods, etc. And so now you're getting to partial regionally regulated, it's warning labels and personal choices. And then as you go up, damaging institutions. And in America, unlike many other countries, the medical insurance and service delivery is pretty dysfunctional. The marketplace is fundamentally dysfunctional. And it's almost like legalized, extortion, quite frankly. Then you have financial system too big to fail, et cetera. And then you move up and you have the worst case scenario of these destructive institutions. And as I mentioned before, in a neoliberalism environment, pushing for, no regulation, no regulation in these areas leads to basically destruction. It's pretty much that simple. Now, in the bottom left there, just want to make it clear, I'm not looking at trade-offs, of any good aspects of these institutions and where there might be some, trading off the damages. I'm not looking at that at all. This is strictly, are you meeting the criteria of these damages of being a destructive institution? So here's a new definitions hierarchy. And these all these items here are new definitions defined in the framework document. So destructive institution, or you can call it destructive institution for profit, or destructive governments, democratic or totalitarian, et cetera. The destructive institution is composed of a destructive institution core and a complex of amoral power. These are fully defined. We're going to go through a couple of those. The destructive institution core is in the foreground. That we like, let's say in climate, in a fossil fuel institution, which we're all part of if you're buying gasoline. That's in the foreground. The industry is in the foreground. The complex of amoral power, which is the interaction of the power of government, the power of money, and the power of communications or influence, that's working in the background. So that's a kind of a background, invisible hand function here. And the institution core is where gains are being received. So that would be where money is being received. That's where political power is being received, et cetera, and it's visible to the naked eye in the public. The institution core is where the contract comes out of. So that's where the destructive institution contract would emanate from to expose all of us. We are a part of some of these institutions, and that's where the exposure to this contract comes in. And we'll talk more about contract. The complex of amoral power is where what I call destructive institution brain hacking comes in, and a variety of manipulation propaganda techniques. And that comes out of the, you can call it corrupt communications or the communications or influence aspects of this. The other one, which I'll be mentioning often, is legalized corruption. Now, I didn't define it here, but maybe in the next version of this, all these documents are working papers, by the way. I may actually define legalized corruption, but basically it's in America, it's the legalization of what I call corruption, which is the ability to basically have virtually unlimited amount of money flow between politicians and wealthy participants who would like to do some lobbying or corporations, et cetera. So the Supreme Court doesn't call it that, but that's, they're looking at a hair split operation. But for the average citizen, I think you would call it legalized corruption, and many people do. Okay, so we covered destructive institution, again, composed of complex of amoral power in the background and the institution core in the foreground. Institution core, again, exposes the contract. Destructive institution contract. So it's a relationship between the institution core and other entities in society. And then the next clause in the bullet there, this is basically what's driving the core gains, and the core gains are correlated with powerful and large-scale destruction. So you look at those, climate change, et cetera, whether you like it or not. You could talk about this all they want. The bottom line is that the environment is being destroyed, right, and profits are being made. So that's the correlation of large-scale destruction, in this case with financial gain. The next two clauses, and the bottom bullet there, get into the feedback on the system side of this. And so this is the rewards and reinforcement of rewards, where you have a very significant control, positive feedback control. So, you're earning money, you're gaining political power, whatever you're gaining, you have a very, very strong positive feedback response there. The next one is the negative feedback loop, which is basically out of control and throttled down. So in this case, you have an out of control situation where there's no or lack of control response to negative feedback, with a malfunctioning or poor checks and balances to the destruction. And that's where brain hacking comes in, to get the propaganda, to get mass support for your for your destructive behaviors. And then the next one is the unalienable rights. And so unalienable rights such as life, liberty, pursuit of happiness are neglected, degraded, or destroyed. And typically when I want to identify a destructive institution, I start there. And then I start looking for the feedback channels. You know, is negative feedback throttled down? Is positive feedback enhanced? Is it large scale destruction, et cetera? But basically looking at unalienable rights first. And if you look at all the applications we're looking at in this body of work to date, they are all unalienable rights are all unquestionably being neglected, degraded, or destroyed. And then the last one is basically the relationship is unrepairable to make it right in an ethical society. In other words, you have to get rid of these things. These don't have any place in an ethical society. Complex of amoral power. I just want to talk a little bit more about that. I'll show a diagram of that. It's the relationship between the power of money, the power of government, and the power of communication influence that results in amoral or corrupt money flows, government enforcement actions, communication influences. And this is the primary source of brain hacking out of that complex, or out of the destructive institution. Brain hacking. This is the institutional. It's either amoral or corrupt. You know, quite frankly, play into the various mental mechanisms that you can have out there. You know, everything from talking about deep state conspiracies to, you know, ignore the corruption before your eyes. You know, a variety of things, right? But, you know, bottom line is, you know, you're solidifying. The goal is to solidify supporters, such that they have low to no empathy to the destruction and human impacts, and therefore you disable checks and balances. So this is a key mechanism in throttling down the negative feedback flow that you would expect society to say, hey, enough of this destruction. Okay, and if you take a look at Haisu's presentation, which is next, from a destructive institution perspective, that's a deep dive into brain hacking regarding the coal miners in China there. So it's a very good piece of work. I've looked over that work already. So we're going to get into some diagrams now. So you're going to be seeing these symbols over again. You're going to see the power symbol, the money symbol, and the communication symbol here. And this shows you the complex of amoral power and the relationship between them, that amoral mutual self-preservation and growth that they're looking for. I'm showing on the side there, you see the linkages to social sciences concepts. I'm not going to get into that. If you take a look at the paper on the framework, you're going to see some significant description of that. And I really would love some feedback on that. I know your folks here are much more in tune with that from your research backgrounds. The one I will bring up is spontaneous order. There's a natural or intrinsic affinity between these entities here, these functions in society. You know, so I don't care whether you're feudal system, communist, capitalist, whatever they are, right? There's a natural affinity for these functions in society. And so they play well, they play much better together than they do apart. Complex of amoral power can easily transition to systematic corruption with understood damages or collateral damages, and these are sometimes seen as unintended consequences in society. You say, well, how'd that happen? You know, well, not to get into conspiracy theories here again, but reality is that if you have this complex of amoral power, which is observable in America, okay, it's explicitly observable, and especially more on the right-wing side, but definitely on the left-wing side as well. You know, unintended consequences prop up out of this, whether it's climate-related or mass shootings, whatever they might be, they're cropping up. Corruption has a multiplier effect by spawning and sustaining harms and damages, and you know, specifically legalized corruption is much worse than society realizes. It's gotten used to it, which is a real problem, I think, for society. And you really get a metastasis here of harms, damages, and destruction. So this is showing the complex of amoral power for a destructive institution for profit that's gone corrupt. And this is, I think, would describe America regarding legalized corruption and the nonstop brain hacking going on in the crazy media that we see. And so basically you see destructive institution core at the top, which is money oriented, and it's divvying out its money and reward to the other entities. And then you have the corrupt government power. I'm calling it, again, legalized corruption here. Just keep it clear. That's what I'm calling it. And providing enabling laws and regulations to allow disruption to occur and the corrupt communications to occur, and then the corrupt communications is working on brain hacking, and then you can have the downstream brain hacking and downstream support by the government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can see some of the linkages to social sciences here as well. Okay, so destructive governments, I'll show you a diagram in that in a second. It's very similar. The difference is the government is the dominant force here. And you can see this in totalitarian states, dictatorships, or democratic states, regarding refugees, for example. Democratic states are the ones that are trashing refugees right now, for the most part. And then you can also have supporting enterprises work with these destructive governments. So this is how that looks, and the difference is the government's on top in this case, and that's where the contract's coming out of. And very similar to the last one, except rather than it being for profit, this is really more for political power. And then you have the supporting institutions on the left and corrupt communications on the other side. But very, very similar in terms of they're using their functions to work together. Okay, so the first one I took a look at, the first application I looked at was chattel slavery. And this is how I developed the contract in general. Chattel slavery, property slavery, right? And I used in America the 1860s when the Confederate States of America were created, where the complex of amoral power, they had a lot of money, millionaires were being made on cotton picking, and they were using slaves to the max in that, and that was a key part of that major capitalist system there. And so the strain became too much. They seceded, the Civil War started, ultimately to eliminate the contract of slavery, you had to eliminate the complex of amoral power. And you will see that, like, for example, in the American Revolution, to eliminate the destructive institution contract of tyranny from Britain, the amoral complex had to be disrupted or destroyed in that case, at least in the 13 states in North America. And so you'll see this come up later as kind of a principle, but you'll see that over and over again. Like Nazis is another good one, right? If you want to get rid of the destructive institution contracts coming out of Nazi world, you had to disrupt the amoral power there, complex. I just want to cover very quickly myths. There's a lot of myths in America about slavery, that it was somehow good treatment and blah, blah, blah. It's very similar to the brain hacking you'll see across the board, right? A lot of denial, a lot of rationalizations, sometimes called the lost cause of the Confederacy in America. And it was unquestionably destruction of unalienable rights, no question about it. This is the diagram, and you're going to be seeing this diagram, kind of similar diagrams now, and you'll see the complex of amoral power symbols being used. That's in the background. So I'm showing that, so now I'm showing the foreground more, but they're still in the background. I know I got to be cognizant of my time here. The key difference here is the slaves are part of the core. So that's, this chattel, their property. So, they're equivalent to a machine, a cotton gin at the time. They're equivalent to a horse or cattle or a cart, effectively, right? Whatever tool is needed for production, they're part of it. So they're part of the core. You can read the side here. They're, golden rule, seriously impacted by the people perpetrating this destruction. So you get blowback on yourself. And then the brain hacking after the war, unfortunately, propagated to the blacks up until today, regarding racism, went through Jim Crow, lynchings, the whole 9 yards, and we're still having some serious problems in that in America. So here's a general model for destructive institutions for profit. So as opposed to the last one, slavery, the slaves were in the core. That's no longer the case. So now the targets of destruction are external. So general population mostly. So I'll be covering climate crisis, mass shooting crisis, and opioid next. And you can see the flows of the destructive institution contract. You have products and services coming out, money coming in, and then effectively the policy. And I'll show you how that manifests. So climate crisis. So you have a cascading destruction of life support systems, which cascade to destruction of unalienable rights here. And the complex of amoral power using legalized corruption, money flows, and destructive institution brain hacking, well, you know, denial of science, et cetera, you see very, very prominent in America and around the world. So this would be the diagram for that. And you can see the fossil fuel services on the bottom going to general population, and then you can see the flow up to destroying the the climate and the ecosystem, and then we get blowback, right? So we are a part of this institution, right? Buying gas, it is part of the system we live in, and then we're stoking the destruction of our own life support systems on the blowback side of this, and then you can see on the side some of the on the left side, some of the results of the climate crisis. I won't go through them in the interest of time. You can look at them yourself. And then I also describe the contract here, what's happening. Underlying every one of these is legalized corruption and destructive institution brain hacking is the enabling and supporting factors here. So mass shootings, poor regulation virtually ensures that guns will find their way into wrong hands. And then that forces good guys to buy guns. Again, very similar to climate change, legalized corruption flows, money flows, and then you have destructive institution brain hacking. It's really sad. I mean, America has a strong gun culture, but so do other countries like Switzerland, Israel, etc. And they don't have the problem we have. It's just due to the very extremely poor regulation that we have in our country. So here's that flow, very similar to the previous one. So I'll not cover it in the interest of time. I know that we're running a little short here. Opioid crisis. Opioids were promoted as normal pain management, professional doctor continuing education, and last year a multi-state lawsuit cropped up to try to bring them back into control, but forget it. Destruction's done, and now you have addicted people hitting the black market looking for their fixes. Very similar flow here. I'll not cover that in the interest of time. Democratic destructive government. So this is the overall structure for that, and you can see the power has moved into the core. So now you're looking at the destructive government core there, and the money bag has gone out into the as supporting enterprises, and very similar. So now you're seeing what's coming out as a way of contracts. You're having everything's related to governmental action, and I'll be covering very quickly. I'm just going to go through 3 of these, and I'll move through quick. So worldwide refugee crisis, I don't have to tell you folks, you guys are well steeped into that. I think you understand the background on it, et cetera, convenient scapegoats. This is how that would look in this diagram. You could see the enforcement actions coming out in the way of the contracts, and then you can see the cascading low empathy and xenophobia flowing out of the society into destruction of these asylum-seeking refugees. And again, a glaring destruction, degradation of golden rule by the people perpetrating it. So it's a self-destruction to the people perpetrating as well. Federal government, we'll talk more about this later, but I don't know if you've been following our U.S. federal government response, but it's completely perverse. That's putting it mildly. It's been characterized, to my mind, as non-feasance, misfeasance, and malfeasance, with failures across the board. So failure to prepare, failure to take proper action, cutting, agencies disbanding, pandemic response teams, mismanagement, dysfunction, and execution, and driving shortages by not using proper tools to take care of shortages, causing bidding wars, et cetera, and then using disinformation, political fights as a distraction. This is the model there. You can see how kind of it worked. You have corporations in the middle of this at the bottom, causing shortages, and the states are vying against each other for masks and ventilators and everything else going on there. It's a pretty chaotic situation. Meanwhile, we get disinformation flowing out of the federal government. It's a pretty sad situation to see.
Michael, can you perhaps go conclude your presentation, because I really want to make sure that we've got some time for questions, and we've got separate also, discussions on COVID and refugees crisis. I'm sure you have a chance to explain this a little bit more further.
Absolutely, I will. Let me just go to the conclusion. So this is the perverse capitalism. I won't cover that. I'll cover this as well, that COVID is an enhancer for destructive institutions across the board, not just creating those two, but across the board. It's increased legalized corruption and increased brain hacking. So to get to the key principle here on how do you eliminate these things, right? So again, not going to any specific one, to eliminate any one of these, you have to eliminate the contracts. You have to get rid of these destructive institution contracts. And the only way to do that, as we saw in the Civil War, or we saw the other ones, you have to severely disrupt the supporting amoral complex by complex of amoral power by legal means. Now, I'm not saying you need a war in every one of these cases. I think America has the right tools to do it, right? In the way of, at least in America, with voting, getting off the couch, go do something about this without having to have a riot. And I'm not proposing that at all. But if you want to get rid of the complex of amoral power, you have to hit them where it hurts. That's legalized corruption and destructive institution brain hacking. So you have to severely disrupt that or eliminate by legal means. So I'll end it here. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was very intense, and I'm sure, this presentation would require, I would love to hear much more, because it's so dense, lots of information packed in one presentation. And I hope you'll have a chance to maybe in our discussion in our group to tell us a little bit more. But right now, let's go to questions. Anyone? Are there any questions? You just unmute yourself and start asking.
Hi, Michael.
Hi,
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
There's definitely a lot to digest, but I have a clarifying question about your slide 9. On that slide, you rated all the industries on different levels by harm and damages they do. I'm just wondering, how you rate all of these industries, and particularly, I think I saw on the very top, you were talking about the climate crisis, or for the fuel, those topics are poorly regulated, and some are not reasonably regulated. So I just want to know more about how you rate these and how you rating them, how regulated they are.
Yeah, so this will be a very good area for further study. I came up with this more so because, again, I was focusing on the worst of the worst, destructive institutions. And then I said, well, you got to look at this in context. And so I started looking at other ones that are dialing it down a little bit. And quite frankly, I think you can come up with different contracts for each one of these types, right? I just did destructive institution contracts. You can come up with other institutional contracts. I think we can do that. So this was qualitative, strictly, just qualitative. I did not do any quantitative analysis here. I made some hard calls on whether or not medical, quite frankly, I almost wanted to call medical all of pharmaceutical dysfunctional. Almost destructive. Because in America, as you know, Sue, you could look around, insulin as an example, right? It's been around for how many years? And meanwhile, the cost skyrocketed, or we get somebody buying, like we saw in the paper, guy went to jail, buying a pharmaceutical company, jacks up the price 10,000, right? Just because he could, right? You want to live, cough it up, right? It's really a legalized extortion is what's going on here. So bottom line is, it was kind of qualitative based on judgment. It wasn't based on anything quantitative. And I think that would be a good area to study, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I can address a question. Actually, it's a continuation of what we already talked with Michael on email, because it seems to me, this is why Ivana said it's a bit, there is a lot to, no, Haisu actually said she's a lot to digest. So I think there are some quite, I think, strong concepts that are used here, like a moral power, destructive institution. And I think, I mean, in Europe at least, I think the sociological discourse, I think now it's much more politically correct and prudent. So we discuss more about ignorance, which is produced at the level of the society, the need to raise awareness, path dependency, complexity. So we use, I think, we would make maybe the same paper and address the same problems, but we would be maybe not so direct in pointing to the power relations. Or even if we were talking about power, I think we would do this more as like relational power between people, and also we would bring in concepts like as uncertainty, complexity. Can you a bit maybe relate to this? Why is this dissonance? I think because also usually when I'm talking with researchers from the United States, they have a completely different discourse than in Europe. So they are much more open in attacking this power in this Weberian sense, or not Weberian, but the power coming from the elite, or which lacks legitimacy. So maybe you can tell us more about. For example, there is a slide that you say that your concept of destruction institutions doesn't include any positive effects. So why this lack of? I mean, why this? Why are you still targeting the target?
Yeah, I think it's the reason I say I think it's independent of political system. So I mean, I think it's independent whether or not you're a communist, system can go bad, a capitalist system can go bad. Capitalist system under strain might go fascist, right? A communist system under strain might go totalitarian, right? And so I think it's just kind of a baked in human nature with this complex of amoral power and the notion that, hey, we're here to either exert our power as a government, or we're here to, to make money, and please don't stand in our way. And I think that's what kind of neoliberalism is in that regard. Now, as far as the directness, yeah, I mean, I'm not holding back any punches here. I mean, I'm looking when I took a look at some of the kind of the world state of affairs when I started this about a year ago. I said, let me just start modeling it, right? What am I seeing here? And so I was just very direct with this. I wasn't looking at any of the the subtleties and nuances of worrying about offending someone in the political class or whatever. I'm just looking at this straight up and saying, hey, what am I seeing here? And I'm seeing destruction, right? That's what I'm seeing. And so how do I characterize that? So I came away of trying to characterize it. Now I think you could do some quantitative work here, quite frankly, and I think, as you mentioned, I mean, Adriana, you have ignorance very much related to brain hacking, right? You have some of the power scenarios that you have in Europe, or you might put in maybe a more subtle way, right? But it's very much related to complex of amoral power, right? And how that operates, and how money, power, and communications flow. So I think and again, this is done in a Creative Commons 4.0. So if anyone wants to go take and do some further work on this in any way, shape, or form, any direction you want to go, it's already written permission to do that with a copyright license on this, right? The whole body of work.